Mid-90s Sega is often criticized for their hubris. After a solid few years, they slowly lost consumer trust by releasing too much hardware without the quality games to justify them. And if there's any game that the moment you start playing feels like it was made by self-indulgent egomaniacs who think they can get away with anything, it has to be Sega's 96 Saturn title Nights into Dreams.
What?
And that's okay. Wait, no, it's not okay. You start wandering around as this child in a dream who gets the snot kicked out of him, and then you walk to a podium and take control of a jester who you start flip-flopping around as, grabbing weird sparkly bits. The gameplay of Nights is actually pretty straightforward, but the game's total disinterest in explaining itself properly for no real reason, while also smacking you on the head, is tremendously obnoxious. This jester, Nights, as a character, feels like a personification of mid-90s Sega. Of course, Sega's latest mascot has to be an omnipotent wizard who expects you to be in awe of them. A flawless, whimsical entertainer who smiles at the player, expectantly awaiting applause before having done anything to really earn it. When I think of Nights, though, I can't help but also think of another 2.5D dream traveler from the 90s, Klonoa, from Klonoa Door to Phantomile, the Namco platformer, released just a year after Nights. Klonoa is a dream traveler, but he isn't a tall, slender, all-powerful jester, but a small little guy. He has an appealing design and has powers others around him don't, but the journey he goes on is a struggle, fraught with different emotions. He even has to strain himself to make certain jumps. He is framed as small and outmatched by the nightmare-themed enemies around him, and that shifts the dynamic relative to something like Nights. His small, low status makes you feel in awe of the dreamlike world around you, while Nights expects you to be in awe of him, cheapening the dream world around him. It's not terribly satisfying to see him overcome things either. Into Dreams, though, isn't oblivious to the fact that having an unaffected dream deity guy fly around abstract dream worlds doesn't give the player much to grab onto or relate to, so if you run out of time, you'll be knocked back to playing as a dreaming child who you couldn't possibly begin to care about. Both playable kids are introduced in a title screen FMV where they're dealing with some mundane real-life problem. In a way, the playable characters of Nights give us the worst of both worlds. Bland human kids, straight out of a drug PSA from the 80s on one side, and a completely unknowable, unrelatable trickster spirit on the other. Klonoa, I think, strikes the right balance by kind of combining both types of characters. He's, on the one hand, an otherworldly creature of sorts with powers, but he's also a young, wide-eyed character with much to discover about the world around him, with who players can identify with. Klonoa can be surprised and feel daunted about things, and have relationships important to him that need protecting. No matter the protagonist, though, there's no getting around how artificial the worlds of Nights feel. When playing as the kids, the pop-in is so bad you can clearly see the boundaries of the world, making it clear that you're in like a square cube, like a themed playground being undermined by the motorway visible from the swing set. Klonoa's levels don't have such visible seams. They feel like sprawling, unknowable places that stretch out beyond where the player can see. Not that conceptually I think levels like Soft Museum would have been something to write home about, no matter how it was drawn, and I've also never really understood the appeal of the desert levels with nasty metal scaffolding all over the place. Sega was so into at the time either, cropping up in Nights and in the 3D Sonic games that would follow it. There's an argument to be made that there's not much point comparing the levels in Nights to those in Klonoa beyond a certain extent. Klonoa is a game that doesn't mind if you take your time and often lets its levels breathe, calming, evocative music playing. And Nights is a score attack game that demands you get a high score as fast as possible. Complaining that Nights doesn't let you sit on a terrace and soak up the night sky like Klonoa would be to criticize its core concept. But maybe it deserves that a little too. Did Sega need another fast-paced 2D game with a focus on memorization with a different setting and lead when they already had Sonic? One that, despite its whimsical dreamlike style and floating graceful protagonist, is almost more insistent and hectic than cheeky Sonic's gameplay was in his original titles. I'm probably not the first person to make the argument that Sega's heavy focus on arcade-style timed score attack titles all the way up to the early 2000s is why they started to lose their high position in the game market. Even with a few exceptions sprinkled in here and there, that lack of variety must have turned some people away. The game design often feels at odds with the idea of the game conceptually, like how it's trying to be this moon logic game where you have to intuit what even things are, but also there are big signs saying this way to level 2. Nothing more dreamlike than that. So yeah, Knights is a score attack game, where you have to collect enough items as quickly as possible in a looping course within a time limit. The more laps you do before the time runs out, the more items you can pick up. Klonoa is a level-based platformer where you have to reach the end of the level but at your leisure, with optional items to pick up along the way that can unlock different bonuses. What makes collecting stuff fast hard in Knights is that in a 2D perspective, the player can't see where they're going, so you either have to react inhumanly fast or memorize the courses. This game would be a whole lot easier and potentially fairer if the camera faced where Knights is looking, like it does in certain parts of the levels. Now look, challenge in all games is dependent on how the game limits the player. Maybe the 2D perspective here was always intended to fill the role of that limitation, or maybe they realized how awful the game would look if the camera was facing forward with how bad the pop-in is. Evident here, one of the few times it does that. Either way though, there's something that feels kind of arbitrary about how Knights limits your visibility within a space that is technically 3D. Klonoa is the opposite. You have to capture and aim enemies in different directions to perform attacks and higher jumps. Something that in a fully 3D space would actually be much harder to do with precision if your shooting directions expanded from a mere 5 to a whole 360 degrees worth of angles. The game being 2D is giving you the best tools for the job. Knights gives you a simple task and then limits you by stacking the deck against you, while Klonoa comes across as more intuitive by giving you more complex tasks, but without it feeling like information is being overtly held back from the player. Knights has more going on the screen at a given moment, but it doesn't benefit the gameplay. Klonoa's cleaner look makes the game easier to read, and it's probably what helped it run at double the frame rate compared to Knights. Of course, Klonoa also makes better use of the 0.5 and the 2.5D style, by letting the player very directly interact with elements within and without the screen. While in Knights, this aspect of the presentation feels fairly cosmetic. Sometimes you can see things on the side of the screen that are going to appear later down the course, but the tracks weave around so chaotically, I rarely found it helpful in any meaningful way. The only times it feels like significantly more than a cosmetic flourish is in some of the boss fights, where the player can anticipate the boss's moves in some way by letting you see where they are in the 3D space. This in no way helps the bosses be very good though. They're not natural extensions of the gameplay. Instead, you're thrown into an arena with a bomb about to go off and have to figure out what Knights needs to be flung into and how he has to be flung into it before the timer hits 0. If you don't succeed in time, you have to redo the whole previous level again, and only being given one attempt at that comes off as a way to pad the game out. Especially egregious in a few of the fights, like the mouse fireworks fight, where you have to realize quick your focus should be on the fireworks and not the boss. It's an inversion of the core gameplay too, because while the main levels want you to maximize every second and stay in the level to get points as long as you can, here the more time left before you beat them the better. This is all in stark contrast to Klonoa, where the bosses feel like a very natural extension of the core gameplay of using grabbed foes to jump and attack, with each one usually testing you on a different application for that mechanic, all of them putting their own spin on it. Spiral dashing into enemies is something Knights doesn't do outside of bosses, and it makes them feel like they're here out of obligation, rather than to test the player on any learned skill. I will say Knights isn't devoid of well-directed moments. There's one in the final level I thought was quite good. Skip ahead on the progress bar if you don't want to see it. In the final stage, Knights is incapacitated and you can't activate him as the child. You're left with no options but to start messing around, and some balloons flying up in the air may give you the wild idea to try riding the current up to Knights. If you jump off this platform though, your kid immediately plummets like a rock. The game lingers on the fall just long enough to make you think this is a fail state. A quite shocking fail state. You don't anticipate that a game this lighthearted and jovial would show a real kid falling to their death as a possible outcome. Until it's revealed to be a psych out, where the kid flies back up and you're now in control of him, but with the powers of knights. Why can he do this now? Well, you have to just fill in the blanks there. It's the final level and the child has pulled the resolve out of the hat. It's an effective moment, but it's sort of the only moment. It's not really built up to in any way, in a way that could have taken it from good to stunning. It's a moment that sort of exists in isolation. After that, the kids stop the evil wizard and win the basketball game or whatever. Meanwhile, Klonoa drips with emotion and feeling from the second you put the disc in. Rather than make the game quote-unquote dreamlike with a bunch of random stuff coming at you and soft museum, the dreamlike nature of Klonoa is communicated with this ever-present bittersweet melancholic mood that underlines the fleeting nature of dreams by making the player experience real significant losses along the way, especially at the end. The Klonoa series is about acceptance. It's about coming to terms with loss and things out of your control and making the most of it. And that is the perfect theme to focus on when dealing with dreams, worlds that come and go and can never be yours. You can hear more about how those moments are constructed in my Klonoa videos, especially the one I did on the second game, which I'd recommend watching after having beaten both Klonoa titles. Knights doesn't seem to be about much of anything, and a fun little game doesn't necessarily have to be, but its attempts to wear the aesthetic of something with meaning at times is what annoys me a little. You get the sense the game wants to be praised for its world and vision and ideas, but gives you the most boilerplate material. Children breaking through purgatory worlds so they can go win the singing competition. Elegant knights can unlock the hidden potential in us all if we smack an evil cape man hard enough. Negative people in our life are like ghouly monsters we need to overcome. It's like a checklist of very basic, empty gestures towards meaning. And when you see a game like Klonoa earnestly attempt to convey emotion and meaning, it just lowers your opinion of something like Knights. The few cutscenes that are here feel like wasted air compared to the effort Klonoa puts into building up to its most emotional beats. Dreams may seem like an easy setting to put your game in. After all, anything abstract or non-Euclidean is acceptably dreamy, right? But I don't agree. Do people really have dreams that are just total random chaotic nonsense? Like the places in Knights? Is that really dreamlike? You know, I'm talking about dreams where substances weren't involved. Perhaps it seems mean to be so critical to Knights today, when the franchise has become as niche as it gets. But let's not forget this wasn't pitched at the time as some niche game for enthusiasts, but the next flagship game of one of the main console manufacturers of its day. I'm honestly doing Knights a favor by comparing it to a 2.5D contemporary developed by a third party, because that isn't what people were doing when Knights came out. They were comparing it to its actual rivals, the other console's big mascots of the day, and the comparison wasn't flattering for Sega. You can argue Klonoa never founded some great franchise empire either, but at least it inspired one of the greatest sequels of all time, and that's better than a lot of games get. A kind of this-will-do energy radiates from it. We're top dog, whatever, people will respect this. The loose controls can be mastered, the tracks can be memorized, and you can enact these perfect runs that will reward you with high ranks. But, you know, the same could be said of DMC2. So I guess that actually doesn't mean anything by itself. You know, it sounds good though, doesn't it? Something unfortunate is that despite giving the player no guidance at the start, maybe in an attempt to avoid having some tutorial or slow ramp up that you'd have to do again when replaying the game, Knight still has so many traffic cones set up to get in the way of enjoying the core gameplay of acrobatically doing loops and getting points, whether it be the sloppy bosses or the big run-ending punishments for certain mistakes, like gliding just off the mark and being flung into the waste time-o-matic 3000 over here. It's a shame the no tutorial, no hand-holding thing doesn't pan out, because as someone who has played Klonoa a lot of times, having that game ramp up a little faster in challenge would suit me better nearly 3 decades later. The interesting concept at the core of Knights, essentially, what if a Sonic course had you try and complete a single level as many times as possible in a allotted time, seems to have been conceived, and then everything else is haphazard and undercooked. From the rest of the gameplay, the setting, the story. Klonoa has a cool core gameplay concept, but its implementation and everything around it is thought out and polished too. From how mechanics are introduced, to the feel of the game, to the story and themes. In contrast to Knights, it has this going all out energy. It's also a short game, but it feels meaty. I mean, it has a multi-stage final boss, instead of it just clocking out after 30 seconds. Every aspect of the game comes across as a statement of intent to stand out with both originality and quality. A quality that holds up years later beyond the appeal of the intangible mid-90s gaming mood the titles offer. It's a mood I'm usually a sucker for. But if you ask me who I want to be all these years later, rather than the jester, I choose the king.